cold start in an LT4. Looks like we need to get some gas this morning and hit the mountain. It was a long day at work, going home after sunset. We are in a Jeep that is very mild. It is extremely smooth. You would have no idea the potential of this engine. This is an LT4 with a 10-speed, but just driving it here in traffic, you would say it's just as mild as a Pentastar V6 or an LT1. You just can't tell the difference. This Jeep feels quieter and smoother than some of the previous LT4s. They were earlier JKs. The later JKs have more insulation and isolation, and I think this is a 16. It could be 15, I'm not sure, but it's a later model JK. Has metal cloak game changer suspension, which in and of itself is very smooth. We're using the hydraulic Motec motor mounts, so that's really smooth. It's just a really tight, quiet, smooth Jeep, and you could drive it all day. You could drive it across the country with no issues. But the flip side of that is just how much tremendous power it has. This Jeep's pushing 700 horsepower. When you see some of these high-performance JKs, whether they're Hellcats or blown LSs, they tend to be quite loud and obnoxious, and in some cases a little bit ratty. But this Jeep is completely the opposite. It's very refined. It's very smooth. This 10-speed almost feels like a 1-speed. You just give it throttle and you go. You don't know what gear you're in. It just pulls. The exhaust in this Jeep is really quiet. We did go with larger exhaust than we normally do, but we went conservative on the muffler. I don't even think it's as loud as a Corvette or a Camaro with an LT4. So what do we got with this engine? Well, we got about 20 times the horsepower of that Volkswagen Beetle. Those things were about 30, 35 horsepower in some models. We have a direct injected continuous variable valve timing V8 with, I believe, 10-to-1 compression, and we're running about 9.7 pounds of boost. We have an intercooler system, water to air, that is controlled by the engine computer. That means when the air intake or the air temp is high, it turns on the cooler pump and recirculates the water. There's a heat exchanger both in front of the radiator, which most of you call an intercooler, and then another one inside the intake valley, which we'll call a heat exchanger. And that really has been the trend with superchargers for a long time. The TVS style blowers, you can really make them compact. Some of the early JKs used a air-to-air intercooler, the centrifugals especially, and they take a lot of room up. They use giant pipes, like 4-inch pipes, and you had to cut and trim things. The water-to-air intercooler just uses basically heater hose. It's just coolant that's circulating, and then the computer turns the pump on and off as needed. Because the intercooler is behind the fan, or in front of the fan is behind the intercooler, as the fan turns on, it pulls the hot air out of the intercooler. So it is a fan-controlled, and that's kind of important because the GM computer is properly programmed to wind up for coolant temp, trans temp, intercooler temp, AC pressure, intake air temperature, a lot of other stuff. And I know some guys just run the fan wide open, but we don't do that. We actually control it properly because let's say this Jeep goes back to where it's from, and I don't even remember where this is from. I think it's Texas. But let's say you get down into the freezing temps. There's no reason to have those fans running all the time. So we have a computer-controlled fan. We have computer-controlled wastegate. The wastegate is basically what bleeds off the excessive pressure. You can't just put unlimited pressure or boost into your engine. You're probably going to blow it up. And yes, I have done that in the past. Today, they're very sophisticated and electronically controlled. We've got multiple MAP sensors, or manifold absolute pressure sensors, on this engine. We've got sensors before and after the blower, so we know what the intake manifold pressure is before it's compressed and after it's compressed. When you compress air, it increases temperature. So the air temperature goes up, and we have an intake air temp sensor that tells the computer, and not only the air intake temp sensor, but this vehicle also has the Gen 5 MAF, or mass airflow sensor, which includes a intake air temp sensor and a humidity sensor, as well as an airflow meter. So we got a lot of data going into this engine before and after the supercharger. The end result is an engine that runs really smooth. In fact, I can't even hear this engine right now. I can't even hear the tires because we got some, I believe we got the BF Goodrich tires on here, and they're really, really quiet. I can hear more transmission than I can engine. And what you end up getting is basically drivability that's on par with a non-supercharged engine. Superchargers are really popular back prior to World War II and during World War II because we were mainly running piston engines. Once we moved over to the turbine engines, the jet engines, a lot of things changed. They had their own internal compressors. But with the piston engine, as the fighter planes and the bombers went up to altitude, the air got thinner and thinner. And with a fixed compression ratio, you would just start losing power. It's about 3% per 1,000 feet. So you go up 10,000 feet, that's 30%. 20,000 feet, do the math, you lose 60% of your power. In World War I, the Zeppelins or the dirigibles could fly at really high altitudes because they used lighter than air gas, whether it was helium or hydrogen. Most people don't know that the United States held a lot of the helium supplies for the world, and they wouldn't give it to Nazi Germany, and that's one of the reasons that the Hindenburg blew up, because it should have been using helium instead of hydrogen, but we would give it to them. So they could fly really high, 30,000 feet, where the fighter planes at the time were pretty primitive and they were piston engine, and they couldn't get up there. So literally these Zeppelins could just fly out of range of the fighters. Well, there had to be a better way to get the piston engine more power, so the turbochargers and the superchargers came to be. And essentially what you're doing is you're cramming more air into the engine. Turbochargers use exhaust gas to power a turbine. Yes, we just had our low fuel light come on. I find that this LT4 is actually getting pretty decent mileage. We're gonna check it out when we do our test drive. Turbochargers use a turbine in the exhaust stream to spin up a compressor wheel, which then forces air into the intake. Superchargers are normally crank driven. So there's some kind of mechanical device, whether it's a belt or a gear, that drives the blower. Now it could be centrifugal, which flings the air outwards, or it can be a longitudinal TVS style blower, like a root style blower. But they do the same thing. They compress the air intake. Now obviously these superchargers, and I say superchargers because technically all that force induction, whether it's a turbocharger or a supercharger, is under the category of a supercharger. These superchargers were mainly effective at high altitude, but hot rodders, indie guys got a hold of these things and realized that if you put them on an engine at low altitude, you were going to put out more power. Aircraft engines were designed to run superchargers and turbochargers. If you look at the P-51, it was an excellent low altitude aircraft. The P-51A was just a dream at low altitudes, and they used it as a low level bomber, but it was somewhat susceptible because it was water cooled, unlike the radials. However, when it got up to altitude 20,000 feet plus, it started to lose it. So when they put the Merlin in the P-51, it changed the game, because now we had an engine that ran a lot of manifold pressure. And don't quote me here, I think these guys were running something like 40 inches of boost, 25 to 40 inches of boost. It's tremendous. But you got to remember, at high altitude the air is very thin, so they needed to get air into that combustion chamber. Some of you might remember the Peacemaker long-range bomber. It had I think it was 4 turning and 6 burning. It had both propellers, which have a lot of torque, and turbine engines. And this way it could fly effectively at the low altitudes and the high altitudes. So there was a couple of decades where we transitioned from piston engines into the jet engine. You don't see propeller-driven piston engine planes in commercial airlines much anymore. You might see turboprops, but those days are really over. So what does this have to do with our Jeep? Well, what it has to do with our Jeep is if you want to get more power, there's a lot of ways to do it. You can free up the exhaust, you can free up the intake, you can change the camshaft out. Back in the 70s and 80s, we put big cams in and ram intakes and 3-inch exhaust systems, and sure, we could be putting out 500-600 horsepower just like this engine, but they were radical. If you drove through an underground parking lot, you'd set alarms off. The difference is I'm driving a 650-ish horsepower engine that's as mild as a Toyota Corolla. So getting horsepower the old-fashioned way with cams and high compression and all that worked for its purpose. But if you want to have drivability and horsepower, then forced induction is probably something you want to look at. Now, I don't really think you need 650 horsepower in the average JK unless you want to have fun. I mean, many of us grew up with muscle cars, Corvettes, whatever, and they're fun. I mean, look at the Hellcat Challengers right now. I've got the original 1970 Challenger TA. It's one of my favorite cars. It had a 6-barrel, tri-power, 3 2-barrel carburetors on it. They called it the 340 6-pack. And I love driving that car. I drove it all through high school, and I still have it today. So there's a time and a place for everything. And I can tell you that the JK was simply miserable to drive with a stock engine, especially the 3.8. It wasn't about having fun. It was about just getting to your destination safely. I remember back in the 80s, it might have been the early 90s, one of the shops I was working with did some work for Reeves Callaway. And he had a project he called Sledgehammer. It was a Corvette. And he called it Gentleman Quick. And what he meant by that was, instead of some kid at the drag track with a big cam and stacks sticking out of the hood and side pipes and all that, this Corvette was meant to be mild and smooth, drivable for long distances, henceforth Gentleman Quick. The Sledgehammer, I think, was pushing close to 1,000 horsepower. That really started a trend, at least with me, rather than just making a radical engine, which we really couldn't do anymore, because back in the day, when Detroit was pushing cams out in the late 60s, or actually from the 50s and 60s, and the early 70s, it started to go away because of emissions. But the cam overlap and high compression was causing a lot of emissions. You got to remember, when you have a big cam and you have those misfires, the intake valve is closing after bottom dead center. So it's pushing some of that fuel charge out at the lower RPMs. At the higher RPMs of the ram effect, you're getting more fuel air into the cylinder and you're putting more power out. But that's basically hydrocarbons, raw hydrocarbons being blown into the atmosphere. And that just wasn't going to fly for very long, because when Ronald Reagan got the Air Resource Board going in California, most of the other states started to follow. So it was just a matter of time before Detroit had to clean up its act. And unfortunately, the dark days of performance, at least for me, were the 70s and 80s. We started to see some light in the 90s. I remember the Viper came out. The what was that Corvette with the 4 cams? There was, I think, the Z. Gosh, I can't even remember now. But it was a 4-cam Vet with an engine that was made by Mercury Marine. And what those engines did is they showed us the way to future performance, because going the way of the camshaft and the headers was out. So engines started becoming more sophisticated. You know, Ford started doing the EcoBoost with the turbocharger. I remember the Chrysler K cars. They were about as boring as a brown paper bag. But they started to put out some Shelbys and stuff, and they took that little 4-cylinder motor and they put turbochargers on it. If you guys remember the turbocharged K cars, and it started to grow. We started to see turbochargers in the Nissans and other vehicles. Europeans have been using turbochargers for a long time, but they were doing it because they were trying to get enough power to move a car with a 1-liter engine. Literally, they were running these really tiny engines and putting turbos on just to get enough power to move the vehicle. Americans were using the turbochargers for performance. We wanted to get muscle car-like performance, but still meet emission standards, have good drivability, good longevity. Water-cooled turbos came out. The after-run oil systems that would keep the oil flowing over the turbo bearings after you shut the vehicle off. Things like that came around. So I'm trying to give you a timeline here from my perspective, growing up right after the muscle car era, because really, I think the end of the muscle car era was the early 1970s, and I was this little kid back then. But the big picture is we couldn't make horsepower anymore the old-fashioned way. We had to clean up our act, and we had to get more sophisticated. And that is exactly what this LT represents. Of course, there were a lot of steps in between. I think one of the biggest steps was when we went from the small block Chevy, which really has its roots in 1955, and Ford and Chrysler also started to do the high output V8s, which you got to remember, the V8s, the V12s, V16s, they were luxury engines after the turn of the century. But by the 50s and 60s, a lot of family cars had them. So the small block Chevys we were running around in our 90s Corvettes were 40 years old. So when the LS came out in the late 90s, I think it was probably the biggest step that GM had taken in 50 years for automotive engine performance. They took an old antiquated engine, which is still a good engine, don't get me wrong. I'd love to, I still have vehicles with small block Chevys in them, but it's just not what we have today. When they went to the all aluminum construction, made it really strong, boxed in, they took a lot of the technology from the hot rodders, using the cross-bolted 6-bolt mains, skirted blocks, roller cams, roller lifters. A lot of this technology was what you could get for a small block. However, it was very expensive and exotic at the time. So they put that all into a little 5.3. In the late 90s, I remember when the 5.3 LS came out, it was over 300 horsepower. And that was amazing. You got to remember that an LT1, and I mean the original LT1 from 1970, was rated at 370 horsepower, 360 horsepower. And that was 11-to-1 solid lifter, high compression, 11-to-1 engine that required premium gas. This little 5.3 is not only smaller because a 350 is 5.7 liters, but these engines in the late 80s and 90s were putting out 160 horsepower, 180 horsepower. I remember buying Z28s in like 1981 with 195, 210 horsepower, something like that, which this little 5.3 had over 300 horsepower. All aluminum construction, lightweight, fuel injected. Not only fuel injected, but sequentially fuel injected. This was amazing. And I think that was probably the biggest step GM had made up until today. Everything from that point on was a refinement. And of course the Gen 4 engines introduced things like variable valve timing, active fuel management, but the Gen 5s have definitely taken it to a new level. The Gen 5s is what we're here to talk about, and we're specifically going to talk about the Supercharged. Carrying on from last night, what do we have here? We have about 70 years of evolution of the small block Chevy engine. When it comes to overhead valve technology, especially in the V8s, they pretty much went out of favor with the rest of the world a long time ago. They went to overhead cams and double overhead cams and 4-valve cylinders. We're still running a 2-valve V8 overhead valve with push rods. And for a lot of manufacturers, that's just archaic. However, Chevy has proven that these engines can run right up there with the best of them at an affordable cost. By staying with the overhead valve V8 2-valve technology, they can bring the cost way down. You look at a 4-valve Ferrari with all the technology in that, and it's massively expensive, where GM can crank these V8s out at an affordable price. So keeping the basic cost down, GM added things like direct injection, continuous variable valve timing, and it's important to recognize the difference between variable valve timing and continuous variable valve timing, because continuous variable valve timing gives you power in more ranges than standard VVT that just phases open or closed. You're getting high compression. I believe this motor is 10-to-1. You're getting a supercharger with 9.7 pounds of boost. So what we have here is an engine that has the potential of putting a lot of horsepower out. The LT4 has 8 direct injectors, and GM rates it in the mid 600 horsepower. You can easily get 700 horsepower from this engine. One of the concerns is fuel delivery. We want to make sure that the engine has adequate fuel when you get on it, and running out of fuel is always an issue. So GM has a sophisticated operating system with a fuel pump control module and a low pressure pump and a mechanical high pressure pump and multiple sensors. But in order to really get more power than that, pushing 800, 900 horsepower, GM went to the LT5 where they added 8 extra port fuel injectors with a separate module to supplement the primary direct injectors. Sounds complicated, it kind of is, but it's really not any more complex than anything else that's out there today. We're going to be doing an LT5 build here soon, but I can tell you that this LT4 has got a lot of power. It really is a monster, especially in a lighter weight Jeep like this. Cruising along the highway is so effortless, you think you're idling. I'm cruising up the parkway right now, and it feels like I'm just off idle. So in my opinion, the LT4 is not only enough, but more power than really any JK needs. This JK has metal cloaked suspension on it, which is pretty compliant. So when you get on it hard, especially at low speeds, it can get a little bit squirrely. So putting even more horsepower in, I think, would require chassis mods. The reality is you're outperforming 90% of the engines out there. Sure, there might be some Hellefants or Demons out there, but if you compare the drivability of this engine to any of those engines, it's just phenomenal. This engine sits there and ticks over at 500 RPM. It's going to crawl all day. Now, I haven't crawled with this one yet, but I'm going to, and I know it's going to be excellent, but I have crawled with other LT4s. It's quiet. Your wife will drive it. You know, you hear me say that all the time, but there's a lot of these 800 horsepower engines out there that that your wife wouldn't drive. So you get the best of both worlds. Here I am merging onto the freeway. It takes nothing. Just a tap of the throttle and you're there. So what we have done in the last 70 years is we've taken the small block Chevy, which was an excellent engine. Back then it was lower compression, and you got to remember, guys, in the early days we didn't have the oils and we didn't have the fuels that we have today. World War II really stepped up the high octane fuels and the oils, because prior to World War II, a lot of these engines were low pressure oiling or just splash oiling with Babbitt bearings, so they couldn't take the horsepower. When the small block came out, the oiling system was somewhat of a revolution, more than an evolution, because it allowed this engine to put out 300 horsepower, or that engine to put out 300 horsepower reliably with the fuels and the oils of the day. Today, we have excellent synthetic oils, we have high octane fuel. Now, I'm running on pump gas right now, and I've said it many times, GM really does tune their street vehicles for pump gas. Some other manufacturers will make an outrageous claim on horsepower, but I've talked to the engineers and they say that those numbers are really based on ideal conditions with race gas. So we're running 91 octane in this LT4. No knock, it's running excellent. And that's the way it should be. So what we've achieved in the last 70 years is we took the small block Chevy and we removed all the negatives. Meaning, if you wanted to get 400, 500, 600 horsepower, you had to make the engine radical. You had to make the engine less reliable. You had to make the engine less drivable. Well, with this supercharged engine, we're putting out more horsepower than that with perfect drivability. In fact, I would say that most people would drive this JK and not even know that it had a blower on it. It's that smooth and seamlessly integrated. So the bottom line is we have our cake and we can eat it too. The one downside to this engine is the cost, although I do think that for what you're getting, it's a bargain. We're doing the LT4 swaps for just about 40 grand. That includes a new Crate LT1 engine, or LT4 engine, and a Crate 8-speed or 10-speed transmission. This one has the 10-speed excellent transmission. I've done plenty of them with the 8-speed. Again, a good transmission, and the 8-speed is stronger than the 10L80. Now, I see guys out there getting 6.4 Hemis and even LSs in the 30s, and for not much more, you can have a monster engine with perfect drivability. When you get the LT4 swap from us, you're not just getting an engine and a transmission. We've got additional coolers, heavy-duty radiator, we've got an intercooler system with a pump. You're getting a lot of extra stuff, so it's all included in the package. Of course, you got to go with the heavy-duty drive shafts. We are running 1410 rear on this, and there's a good reason for that. We're running a 1350 front. This JK, and yeah, let's talk about this JK for a second. This JK is done, in my opinion, right. There's nothing excessive on it. It's not overly burdened with armor and winches and bumpers and campers sticking off and rock rails and just excess. This Jeep is relatively stock. Now, don't get me wrong, if you're into expedition and you want all that stuff, that's great. But when you have an LT4 in a vehicle like that, you got to drive it a little bit differently than you can drive a vehicle like this. This is almost like a sport JK because it's relatively stock. And if you look at it, and I've had guys in the shop or guys that see it in the shop say, hey, that JK doesn't look like anything special, and it doesn't, but it is. And we've got a Dynatrac D80 in the rear. We've got a Dynatrac 60 in the front. We've got an Atlas twin stick, and this is not a standard Atlas 2 3-to-1. This is the heavy-duty Motec Atlas that Steve over at Advanced builds for us. I don't know what's in it. It's got hardened pins and gears and race case, but I just call Steve up and I say, look, this thing needs to handle 700 horsepower, and he builds it. So this Jeep is like a wolf in sheep's clothing. This Jeep looks like a grocery getter, but underneath it's pure sports car. This thing is just like a Corvette. Actually, this LT4 is tuned for a Cadillac. I've tried a couple of different tunes and I really like this Cadillac tune. It's so smooth. The transmission is like a 1-speed. The power delivery is completely linear. It's just an awesome, awesome combination. And in this Jeep, I don't know what this Jeep weighs. I mean, it's probably 5,000 to 6,000 pound range, but to me it feels like it doesn't weigh anything. The throttle pedal is just like a linear potentiometer. The more you push it down, the faster you go. There is no, the power has to catch up feeling to it. And I know this customer is going to love this Jeep, and he's been very patient. When this Jeep came in, we were building a couple of other LT4s and sorting things out. Things like power steering, because you guys know that the LT4s didn't come with power steering from GM. Air intake, placement, tuning. So he was patient enough to give us the time with it. So we fitted a 10-speed. And yes, this is the first 10-speed LT4 that we built. And I think the end result is phenomenal. And I say that in almost every video, but keep in mind, you got to place things in their category. If you're in a budget of $20,000, $25,000, and you get a L83 with a 10-speed, that's phenomenal for what you're getting. I just shipped a 10-speed 5.3, and I thought it was one of the best running JKs I've ever driven for what it is. Now, it doesn't have 800 horsepower. It has 350 horsepower, but that JK will run for a long, long time, take that customer wherever he wants to go, getting reasonable economy with good reliability. He'll never have to struggle on the highway. So when you look at those factors, it is a phenomenal swap. This is in a different category. This is a performance engine, and for what it is, it's phenomenal in its category. Because believe me, I have driven a lot of JKs with 600 horsepower, and I was not happy. I've had cam JKs that are blowing thousands of hydrocarbons, meaning parts per million of hydrocarbons. I was an emissions inspector, and when a cammed vehicle would come in, it was always a problem. So your eyes were burning, and rump, 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 and your wife's, what's wrong with this Jeep? Why is it so loud? All that. This is completely the opposite. This Jeep is probably faster than 90% of those Jeeps, but my wife would drive it to the store, but I probably wouldn't let her, because when I let her drive our 6.2 JK, she would chirp the tires constantly. But that's what this Jeep is. I remember back in California, we used to call them sleepers. Sneakers and sleepers. Like the guys would put the Sneaky Pete's in their glove box, nitrous, and you'd race them and they'd win, and you didn't know they had nitrous on their vehicle, because nitrous was kind of a taboo. You weren't supposed to run it when you went straight up. But a sleeper was a guy who would just drive out with a stock looking Mustang or Vega or whatever, and you just didn't know what he had under the hood. And that's kind of what this is. Now, if this had all sorts of racing decals on it, Hellcat with the hockey sticks, and let me say, I got a Challenger TA, and that thing is pretty gaudy. It not only looks like a cartoon, it actually has cartoon decals on it. It's got side pipes that stick out that are chrome. It's got a giant inverted P51 hood scoop. It lets you know that it's there for one reason and one reason only, and that's performance. This JK is not. This JK looks like a stock 2016 Rubicon, and on the trails, guys are going to look at it and think, wow, you know, just another guy in a Rubicon, not realizing what this JK is. Now, it does have the Hard Rock hood. I really like the look of the Hard Rock hood. I like it a lot better than the AEV hood or the Moab hood. I was in, where was I? I was with Phil Howell, and he had a prototype 2012 or 13 JK with this hood. And the vents were open. They were actually functional on that vehicle. but it was a prototype, and then it was disappointing to find later on they closed them off, but they had to because the drainage. The problem with hoods like this, the AEV hood, and even the Moab hood is water intrusion. Even my Challenger TA, I told you about that. When it rained, it had that giant hood scoop, so they gave you a plate that blocked it off when it was raining out. So you always got to think about that water intrusion. And with the AEV hood, what I really dislike is that screen mesh lets the water in basically right above the belt drive. So that wasn't a smart thing. And then when they sealed that off and made the Moab hood, water would pool in there, and when you took off, it would come out, and that's fine. But what some guys in the colder climates found was water would pool in there overnight, it would freeze, it would start warming up in the morning and break loose, and then you take off and that big chunk of ice came back and hit your windshield. So there's compromises with a lot of these hoods, and the compromise with this hood is that it reduces hood clearance. A lot of guys think, oh, you're gonna get more hood clearance with that hood, but it doesn't, because those depressions for those grills actually reduce our clearance to the air intake. So there's just a lot of things that we have to look at when we do these LT4, just any LT conversion, because the LT is a more complex operating system. I did a video recently about us versus the other guys, and one of the reasons we can run this engine, and this is a huge reason, is we've developed a system where we have a bridge. We have a bidirectional CAN bridge. So whatever GM comes out with, we can bolt into a vehicle and run it, where they can't. So when this LT4 came out, this wasn't a matter of how are we going to integrate this. That was easy. All we had to do was plug our CAN bridge in. The 10-speed transmission was programmed for the earlier LTs. It was just a matter of plugging that stuff in to our bidirectional interface or bridge, and the rest is history. We have to wait for HP tuners and others to support the unlocking of the controllers and things. But I will say that this vehicle right now is running a completely stock Cadillac CTSV LT4 tune. The transmission has not been, we haven't even unlocked this transmission control module. It's that stock. It was flashed with Delco technical delivery system and left alone, and it's beautiful. There's been no adaptive learning. There's been no quick learning. It's just right out of the gate. This thing is like a 1-speed, like I said. So don't overlook how we are doing this and packaging this. What we have here is a pure GM system, front to rear. GM harness, GM modules, GM engine, GM transmission, and we're letting it do its thing the way GM intended it. And if you look at the sophistication of this engine, if you look at all the stuff going on with the calculations with the coefficient-based operating system and the continuous variable valve timing and the direct injection and the 10-speed transmission and torque converter clutch control, it's just amazing, and it's a massive amount of computing power to make all this work. And I couldn't imagine trying to hack this. I couldn't imagine trying to put a Chrysler transmission behind this, or trying to run this engine off of a non-GM computer. It's just massive. It's like taking the motherboard out of your PC and trying to hack in an Apple board and make it work. It's we're at a level of sophistication right now where you have to remain pure to that manufacturer. And if you look at my videos 8 years ago, 10 years ago, I said the same thing, and a lot of guys got tired of hearing it. But that's why we did it, and that's why we're here. Back then, engines were a lot simpler. And yes, you could just take a LS3 and throw it into a Chrysler operating system and make it work. But those guys are figuring out that that's really not the solution. I need to finish this video on my phone because I filled up the SD card. I yacked so much. 30 years ago, when I was doing engine swaps, it was pretty easy because most vehicles were dumb, meaning you just had a gauge with a sending unit on it. You had an ignition system with 2 wires. There were just regular old-fashioned internal combustion engines. So we could take a Ford and put it in a Chevy. We could take a Chevy and put it in a Chrysler. Whatever you wanted to do. The difference today is that engines are not simple. If we look at the sophistication of this LT4, it's off the charts compared to what we were doing 30 years ago. So there was a lot of guys out there doing engine conversions. You just literally fabricate some mounts, hook up some wires, and go. Today, with all the computers and modules and fuel systems, it's not like it used to be. Now, I'm going to say that this is probably not only the most sophisticated, but in my opinion, one of, if not the best driving JK conversion I've ever driven. And I'm taking all things into account: power, economy, drivability. It's just an amazing vehicle. And I'm proud of it because we were able to take that technology and distill it into this vehicle. Now, don't take that wrong. There's all sorts of other powertrains that I think are awesome in the JK. In fact, my LS 6.2 is awesome because it gets the job done for me. But if you take into account the techno nerd component, that means the technical competence that it took to get this swap done and working. This thing is off the charts. We're not hacking into a Chrysler operating system. We're not trying to use a Chrysler transmission. We are delivering this with virtually everything functional for the customer. So he will have cruise control, and he will have tap shift, and he will have his gauges working, etc. And there's going to be more stuff coming down the road. In fact, we're trying to retro a technology right now that will give your JK more DIC, or driver information. We're looking to try to get port in oil temp and trans temp and all that in the earlier JKs through your VFD, or your vacuum fluorescent display. So we're going to be trying to add functionality to your Jeep, not take it away with an engine conversion. So we're going to hit the road with this LT4, or the trail, and we'll see you shortly.